So let's talk about some legal agreements and contracts. This is section 8 of your artist development plan. And a very important section. Each one of these sections has some validity to the importance of what they are. But your agreements and your contracts are, once again, really an important part of your artist development. And you'll be using things like this throughout your musical career. Lots of agreements in this business, lots of contracts, lots of lawyers. Many people who run major corporations within this business are lawyers. And so you've got to really understand what's going on with this. And it's a big part of your artist development. So Section 8 is on contracts and agreements. One of the primary functions of an agreement is for each of the parties to remain friends. And you're like, what? Yes. So future agreements between collaborators. So I've had this happen with so many clients where they get into an agreement, an oral agreement between members of the band, and after the project's done, one member says, well, wait a minute, where's my half or where's my percentage? And the other party says, what are you talking about? That's not what we agreed on, or something like that. And they're like, no, that's wrong. That's not what we agreed on. And it turns into an argument. And then sometimes the argument turns into the disbandment of the band. The artist breaks up. The collaborators no longer talk to each other. Not good. So it's a real good idea to have all your agreements in writing so that there's no misunderstanding. The last thing you want to do is ruin a friendship over a misunderstanding. So this collaboration of friends or business partners or music business professionals should definitely be in writing. And if you can't get it in writing, and this usually happens with live performances, maybe at the beginning of a career, a talent buyer will say, hey guys, can you play tomorrow? Come on down, I'll pay you $500 or $100 or whatever the fee is. And you go, yeah, that sounds great, we'll see you tomorrow. And you show up and there's another artist on stage. And you go, wait a minute, we're supposed to play. And they're like, oh, no, that's for next week. Well, that's not what we talked about. We talked about it for today. And all of a sudden, it doesn't work. So if that's the case, what I would recommend is that when you get an offer or you get some sort of collaboration for a project, always follow up with an email and just say, hey, looks great. Looking forward to collaborating with you. Here's my understanding of what we've just agreed upon. Is this what you agree upon too? And that way you're putting it in writing. And when they respond back to you, yeah, that looks good. Now it's in writing. And there won't be any misunderstandings that go on between the collaborators. So real important part, the oral agreements are nice and so forth, but you can run into a problem. And we do agreements every day. If we're in the car and we're at a stoplight and someone wants to turn in front of us and they wave, over, hey, can I cut in front of you? And you go, yeah, that's an agreement. Now, will it hold up in court? Not really, not unless there's some witnesses. So it's an important part of it, but we run into agreements all the time. When you go to the grocery store, you have an agreement that when you give them money, you can walk out the store with the merchandise. It's not a written agreement, but it is an agreement. So you get into them all the time. Now, agreements and contracts are a little different. Contracts are usually legally enforceable. An agreement isn't always. But the main point here is to get into your agreements in a good way. The legal part of any artist career is of utmost importance. You've got to be able to go through the steps of what the agreement would be. And part of this would be to hire a good quality music attorney or entertainment attorney to help you with this. So think back about some of the agreements that you might already have in place. And maybe it's prudent for you to put some of those in writing. And here's how I recommend that you do it, because the last thing people want to do is to shove an agreement between you and your best friend. You're trying to work on a recording together or rehearse for a show or those kind of things. And nobody likes the idea of shoving a contract in front of someone that says, here, sign. So here's a good way to do it. You say something along these lines. Hey, I value our friendship. I value our collaboration on this project. To remain friends and to be able to work on future projects, why don't we put our thoughts and our agreement in writing and come up with a contract for this so that there's no misunderstanding, because I really value you as a friend, I value you as a collaborator on this project, and I'd like to work with you in the future. That way you're kind of setting it at ease, and people understand that better than shoving a contract in front of someone's face and say, here, sign. So if you just word it right, it can work really well. And that way everything's up front and it all works out in a good, positive way. So you may have heard stories of an unscrupulous manager, publisher, or agent who stole, quotes, an artist's work. Well, I got to tell you, it's my contention that the artist did not review the legal agreements properly. Had they, I doubt there would be as many stories. So think about yourself. Do you ever go on to the web and download an app and hit submit that you agree and you haven't read the contract? Have you ever read the YouTube contract? Do you know that YouTube makes 22 different copies of your recording when you upload it to YouTube? And that you've granted them permission to do that? I doubt most of you read those. How about the iTunes contract? Have you ever read that? So something to consider, because the problem with those kind of contracts is you can't negotiate. Either it's yes or no. You submit that you agree or you don't. You don't send it back as a work, in progress. Well, I don't agree to this clause and I want to change this clause. Okay. So typically, let me just kind of tell you how it works. And I learned this when I was a booking agent. Actually, I learned this when I was a talent buyer, before I was a booking agent, is that when the contract comes in the mail or email, look it over, read it carefully. If there's something you don't agree with, cross it off and initial it. Keep reading, cross it off and initial it. Keep reading, maybe scratch something out, change a term. Maybe it's not a 24-hour term, maybe it's a 24-week term. I don't know. And initial it. Then send it back to the person who issued you the contract. Have them read over to make sure that they understand. And you might want to call them and tell them that you're going to make these changes. It's not trying to get the better of someone. What you're trying to do is to collaborate. So call them on the phone and say, hey, I want to change this, this, and this, and this. If they agree, they'll initial it too. Or they'll write a new contract and they'll make the changes in there. But usually they'll just initial it also. And that's valid in court. Okay, so as long as both people initial it, it becomes a valid point in an agreement. So first of all, when getting into any agreement, especially in the entertainment business, always hire a qualified music attorney to review the documents and consult for legal opinions. Music and artists should hire a lawyer who specializes in the music industry. One of my clients hired a real estate lawyer to do some of his work. Well, a lawyer is a lawyer and can give you legal advice, but the problem is a real estate lawyer doesn't necessarily know what's missing in a contract. The contract may look good. Who, what, when, where, why, and how much. All that might be there. And the attorney can say, okay, it looks good. And then when you ask about something like royalties to a real estate lawyer, they won't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? How do you get royalties? And so you have to explain to them about songwriting royalties or performance royalties or the different royalties that can go on. So always hire a quality attorney who specializes in the music industry. What I would also think about with an attorney is that many times an attorney can open doors for you that you can't get in on your own. This happens a lot for publishing, for particular in Nashville. So if you were looking to pitch some songs to a major music publisher, they may not be interested in hearing what you have to say or listening to your art. They may just say, we're not interested at this point. However, if you had an attorney who could call and make the call for you, and they know someone at those publishing houses, they can get an appointment for you. Now, what I would recommend is that once you find a good quality attorney, put them on retainer. Hire them and give them some money up front. Maybe $250, maybe $500. I mean, I don't know. So in case you need an attorney last minute, this attorney is already on your payroll. You call them up and say, hey, I've got an issue. I need your help. And being your attorney, which you can put on your website and so forth, that this person is your attorney, they can now start working on your behalf. And once they're on your payroll, you can also ask them for favors about opening doors for you. So something to consider. Now, in addition to a good attorney to do this, a good manager should be able to do this as well. Managers should have the contacts. And a good quality music attorney will also have contacts. Those are contacts that you're going to need for your career. These quality music attorneys know what's missing in the small print, the fine print. They know what's missing. So you can have a standard contract, but sometimes if there's a whole clause missing in the contract, they know that it's missing. Okay? So just remember, a contract is not always what about is in the agreement, but also what is not included in the agreement. And that's the part that always concerns me. My first music attorney, God rest his soul, told me something very interesting. He said, when you get a contract, you have to pretend that you've never been able to read before, and you're going to read this very, very slowly. Very, very slowly. Don't say, give me the contract, where do I sign? Okay? So you're going to read it very slowly and understand every sentence that's in there. And if it refers to another part of the contract, you can go read that very slowly as well. Read the contract very slowly so that you comprehend every word in there. Okay? So other than an agreement with a qualified attorney, the first agreement that an artist will need is most likely going to be a band member agreement. Who's in the band and what's your agreement? Now, I do have a sample. So some of the things that go on in a band member agreement might be things like showing up on time for rehearsals, showing up on time for a gig, not drinking on stage, Maybe no profanity on stage. It depends on what your agreement's going to be. Just remember this: if you act like a professional, you will be treated as a professional. If you act like an amateur, you will be treated as an amateur. So from this point forward, you are a music business professional. And everything you do is going to be professional. So act like one and get treated like one. You may be a new professional in the industry. That's okay. You're still a professional. Act like a professional in this industry. Okay, if management is part of the artist team, the artist is going to need an artist management agreement. So same thing. Talk about the manager, talk about the ins and outs, what's good or bad or ugly about this agreement. And as I'd mentioned to you in the last class about personnel, I recommend that every artist become their own manager until the point where they can afford a manager to be on their team. You want a good quality artist manager. So in addition, artists should be prepared to enter publishing agreements as well as production agreements, performance agreements, merchandising agreements, distribution agreements. The list goes on and on. There's a whole bunch of agreements in this industry. Okay, band agreements. They define the issues related to running the artist's career as a business, as well as how artists will work with people within the band and those on their team. There are details about band agreements. So if you're in a duo, a trio, an orchestra, an ensemble of some sort, you're going to have an agreement. Now, at the beginning, you may think it's just a bunch of friends getting together and doing things. Once again, please consider a written agreement between what you expect from them and what they expect from you. Okay, so here's some types, and this is just a few. So there are artist producer agreements, production agreements, band member agreements, confidentiality agreements, consignment agreements, distribution agreements, download agreements, mechanical license agreements, music licensing agreements, online music distribution agreements, record label agreements, producer agreements, publisher agreements, session players, or a single song publishing agreement, which is the most common thing in the publishing world, would be your single song publishing agreement. Maybe a collaborator agreement for songwriting or a studio rental agreement. What about a synchronization agreement between you and a movie producer? Maybe a vocalist agreement. And then there's always a rider that goes along with many agreements, especially in the live performance arena. So these are just some of a few. So let's just talk about the artist agreements for a moment. Okay, so who are the writers and is there agreement between them? Are they going to agree that they're going to split the profits of any licensing of their song 50-50? If there's more than 2 writers, what's the agreement between 3, 4, or 10? However many writers there are on that piece of art. And what's the agreement between the members of the group? Who owns what? For example, let's say the band breaks up. What happens to the name? Who owns the name of the band? Let's say there's a band fund. And in the band fund, the band agrees that they're going to buy a bus, tour bus, or a van to get them to the gigs. And then someone decides to leave the band. Do they own part of that van or truck or bus? If so, what's the agreement? If they leave the band, what happens? Now, what happens if an individual member donates their vehicle for the use of the band? Does that person get compensated? How much? Maybe there should be an agreement between the use of someone's vehicle and the band. Or what happens if they're at a gig and for some reason their amplifier gets fried? Do they go to the club and sue as a band? Or does the individual go to the club and say, hey, what happened with your power supply? My amp just blew up. These are things to be thought about on what's going on with the agreements. Okay, so what about collaboration agreements? Well, this business is very fond of contracts. The recording, publishing, merchandising, management sides of the industry are contract crazy. Well, in the performance arena, there are indeed contracts, but in the beginning, they are usually either a verbal agreement or a handshake. Well, try and get it in writing, as I'd mentioned to you before. A simple email will suffice. Or a producer agreement. Let's say a producer invites you into the studio, invites the artist into the studio to do a recording. And the artist says, that sounds great, I'll be there tomorrow. And they show up and they do the recording. Who owns the recording? The artist or the producer? And let's flip that hat for a moment. What happens if the artist calls the producer and says, hey, I'd like to get into the studio. Would you produce for me? And the producer says, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. Once again, turns on the recorder. Who owns that recording? The artist or the producer? Or both? Put it into an agreement. Who owns that P-Circle copyright? Okay? So recording sessions for the masters are conducted by a producer at times and places as mutually designated by the artist and the producer. So all the individuals who render services in connection with the recording of masters is usually subject to the artist's approval, but could very easily be subject to the producer's approval. I know many big-time producers who hire a band, not the band of the artist, to come in and do the recording, and then they invite the artist in to lay down the vocals. Okay, what about confidentiality agreements? These are between an owner of information or data where it's shared with another person or entity. This could be song ideas, project ideas, or maybe an idea for a recording or a tour. It could also mean business ideas such as growth plans, sales incentives, market penetration, these kind of things that go on with confidentiality. So if you share an idea with someone, let's say you're a songwriter and you've come up with some good ideas for a new song, and you invite a potential collaborator in to help you with that song, perhaps you might want to sign a confidentiality agreement before you let the person listen to it. You don't want the person walking away and saying, well, I really don't want to work on that song. Thank you very much. Goodbye. And then the next thing you know, they're releasing the same song. Confidential information usually includes all data, materials, products, technology, computer programs, specification, manuals, business plans, software, marketing plans, business ideas, financial information, and any other information that might be disclosed or submitted. So, very important. Confidentiality agreements are very common in this industry. And what about consignment agreements? Consignment is when you give your product or product to someone else to sell for you, and then you recoup the funds later on. This happens a lot at the merchandise table. So let's say that the artist comes in, they hire one of their friends to go run the merch table for them while they're on stage. So they give the friend of theirs a bunch of CDs and some t-shirts and some bumper stickers and all the things that go on the merch table. The artist then goes to the stage and starts playing. They come back later and they say, okay, I'd like to collect our money. And the consignee says, well, I was only able to sell one. the rest of these things, I don't know where they went. They just got stolen. Uh-oh. So perhaps your consignment agreement will be that whoever you're consigning your products to will be responsible for payment of those products. Okay, distribution agreements, and this can be for physical product or for digital product. And then usually I talked about digital product when I say online music distribution, which may be another slide here. But distribution agreements, same thing. You'll be giving your master recordings to a distributor for them to put into record stores, for example. What's the agreement? Are they going to pay you full price, half price? How are they making their money? What happens if there's a defect? What happens if there's a return? Who's going to get paid and who's not going to get paid? Are they going to hold money back, which is typical? They're going to hold money for 90 days to make sure there's no returns. Okay? This usually happens with a record contract or a record company, but it also happens when an artist releases their own material. How about download agreements? Maybe you guys have seen this. When you go to an artist's website and they offer music, you have to click a button that says that you know that you don't own that music and that you are just basically licensing it from them. Okay? You're going to do the same thing on your website. If you're going to have music on your website, you're going to want the fans to click some sort of button that makes them understand that they don't own the music and they don't own the recording. So they can't share it with anybody. Unless, of course, that's in your agreement that they can share it. But these are things you have to consider about these download agreements. Mechanical licenses. Okay, mechanical licenses are granted by a copyright owner to a licensee to record, reproduce, market, and sell a musical composition. Now, we haven't talked about first right yet, but first right is not a mechanical license. It's the first right the first time a song has been recorded. Once it's recorded and published, anybody can record a song, the same song. They still have to have a mechanical license to do so. This happens every time except the first time. First time is called first right. After that, it's called a mechanical license. It's 9.1 cents per song per replication, whether it sells or not. Okay, so this is something that you might want to consider is issuing mechanical license agreements. I would recommend that you look into the Harry Fox Agency and let them do this for you. It's a lot easier. Musical licenses. What happens when you offer a recording to a movie company? It's a master use license. They're licensing the music. So you are licensing the music to someone else for them to either record or put into a sound bed or use it in some other source. So something to consider, music licensing agreements. Here's that online distribution agreement that I was just talking about. If you're going to be releasing recordings on the web, just remember that you're wearing a different hat. You're wearing the hat of a record company. Okay? So you're going to need some sort of online music distribution agreement. When you put your music up on Bandcamp or SoundCloud or TuneCore or Reverb Nation or Sonic Bids or any of those kind of places, you're going to grant them a license that they can reproduce and replicate those recordings via the web. So something you might want to consider with those type of agreements. What about record label agreements? Yeah, well, this is another big thing, okay? So the artist will grant to the record label the right to manufacture, advertise, sell, lease, license, or otherwise use or dispose of recordings embodying their art performances to be recorded upon terms and conditions that the record label may approve. In addition, the artist will grant the record label the right to use their name, likeness, and photograph in connection with the exploitation of the recordings. In return, the record label pays the artist for the rights granted and the services to be rendered. A royalty for each recording manufactured and sold throughout the world. Okay, so sold is the word here. If they sell a copy of a recording, those artists that are on the recording should be compensated with a royalty. If it doesn't sell, the record label doesn't have to pay. Now, this is not the same thing as a mechanical license, which goes to the songwriter or publisher or both. Those are just recordings that are manufactured or replicated. It does not have to be sold. If they're replicated into, let's say they press up 1,000 CDs, the songwriter publisher will get paid no matter what. They've been replicated. The difference. Payments from record labels are made semi-annually. That means twice a year. However, sometimes the record label reserves the right to deduct from the amount of any expenses or royalties previously paid for recordings. So if they give the artist an advance, they want their money back before they'll pay any royalties. So they'll deduct those royalties from the amount that the artist owes the record label. What about session players? Sometimes a record label will hire session players to perform in the recording studio on tracks of specific songs. And so what happens here is they have to hire session players. In order to do that, there's an agreement with the session player. Sometimes it's a work for hire, and sometimes it's a royalty base. So it depends on the agreement that happens. Usually it's a session player agreement is a one-time fee. Now, the Musicians Union has two different contracts for this. One of them is if the session player is going to be performing on a demo, and then there's a higher fee if the musician is going to be performing on a master. So something to consider when you're looking at session player agreements. Studio agreements, yeah, they have agreements too. These agreements may be with the artist, a producer, or a record label when they engage the use of a recording studio's facility. So the agreement will state the name of the artist, the name of the studio, the producer, maybe the record label or a project name, how many tracks might be recorded, maybe an hourly fee that they're going to charge for the use of the studio. And you have to look for little things in these, like what happens if you use musical equipment that the studio owns? Do you get it as a part of your hourly fee? Or is there a rental that you have to make? Sometimes studios rent these keyboards and amps and so forth, and it's not part of the hourly fee. Sometimes a studio has an engineer that comes with the hourly fee, and sometimes they don't. So these are questions that have to come up when you're negotiating studio time. What about vocalist agreements? So record labels regularly hire personal services of vocalists for the purpose of making phonograph recordings, and a vocalist agreement is commonplace. The record label will schedule recording sessions and need to ensure that vocalists perform as agreed. Now, let me give you an example. The artist Peter Gabriel is signed to Geffen Records. He's a vocalist. He's a songwriter and a vocalist. His band is not signed to Geffen Records. So Peter Gabriel can not perform a recording as a vocalist for anybody else other than Geffen Records. His band, on the other hand, can record anywhere they want because they are not signed to Geffen. So, when you talk about vocalist agreements, typically a record label wants that artist to be solely and exclusively theirs. They don't want them going and recording for someone else. And while I'm thinking about this, sometimes once the artist has recorded a great hit song, they realize that they go and re-record it and have a different P-Circle copyright, but the smart record labels know that that's not going to be in the game. I know that Van Morrison would love to re-record Brown Eyed Girl because there's so much royalties that are accumulated for that every summer because it's played everywhere. Okay, a 360 deal. You guys took geometry? You know what a 360 degrees on a circle is? Yeah, the whole ball of wax, okay? So a 360 deal is a business relationship between an artist and a music industry company. The company agrees to provide financial support for the artist, including direct advances as well as funds for marketing, promotion, and touring as an instrument to the artist's lucrative potential. What does this mean? Well, the artist agrees to give a company a percentage of all their interests. All of their interests, including sales of recording music, live performances, publishing, merchandising, and any other income in the music industry. Pretend for a moment that the record label signs an artist and it's $1 million deal. And they get the artist in the studio and they record a great album and they hire some promoters to get it on the radio, and it goes to #1 on Billboard, and it's being played on all the major radio stations all across the United States, and they sell 0 copies. The artist, on the other hand, is capitalizing on these recordings that are on the radio and starts going and playing gigs. Well, they start playing small gigs, but as the radio gets more and more friendly for them, they start playing bigger and bigger and bigger places, making more and more money. But the record label, who put all this money into the artist, receives 0. So the artist is going, this is great. I'm sorry I'm not making any money from my royalties on my recording, but I'm making all this money on my live performances. The question comes up. Would that artist be making any money from their live performances if it was not for the record label? I remember when Green Day was playing clubs at the beginning of the year and then playing arenas by the end of the year. Now, they didn't have a 360 deal, and certainly the record label was selling copies. But what happens if? It's always the what happens if. What if the record company didn't sell any? And Green Day went from playing Peabody's to playing Blossom in the same year. It happens. So the record labels have wised up to this, and now more and more are signing 360 deals with artists because they want to recoup their money quicker. Now, there's some good and bad about this. Now, if I was an artist manager, and I'm working with an artist and I get an offer for a 360 deal, I have to think, okay, if I take this 360 deal and I need help on promotion or publicity or touring, all I have to do is call the record label. They can call my agent, they can call all these other people to make sure things are working right. If I don't have a 360 deal, then I have to call my publicist, work it out so that they coordinate with the promoters, who have to coordinate with the agents, and then I have to call the agent to make sure they get enough flyers and posters and so forth in order to do their job. So I'm making a lot more phone calls, trying to coordinate all the ins and outs of this upcoming tour. Where if I had a 360 deal, I could just call the record label since they're the ones in charge of it all. They can make the calls. They can put it all together. I've already been paid. So there's good and bad about 360 deals. And I guess the important thing to remember is that they do exist and that you do have to pay attention to them. Okay, performance agreements. This is a contract between a promoter and an artist, usually saying that the artist will perform on a certain date at a certain time for agreed upon length of time, what other specific act may be performing with them, and how much they're going to get paid. Many promoters require some sort of written confirmation, and sometimes they do a verbal agreement. So I would recommend trying to do a written confirmation whenever possible. And here's the 4 most common deals that you're going to see with a performance agreement. There are 4. One of them is a flat fee. Okay, come on in. We're going to pay you $300. You can go home. You do your gig. We'll pay you $300 and you're done. Okay, that's one. Flat fee. Second one is a versus deal. Okay, we're going to give you, let's say that I'm the club owner. I'm going to give the artist $300 versus 30% of the door, whichever is higher. So if the artist sells a lot of tickets and there's a lot of people coming to the show, perhaps the artist can make $600. But if nobody shows up, the artist is going to make at least $300. It's a versus, one or the other, whichever is higher. And then there's the plus deal. Okay, so in this deal, I'm going to give the artist a guarantee of $300 plus 30% of the door. So they're going to guarantee $300. So no matter what, they're going to make their $300. But they're also going to make 30% of any tickets that are sold at the door. And then there's a point split example. So let's say what's going to happen here is the artist is going to take 50% over the amount made in ticket sales. However, they're going to split it with other artists. Perhaps they're going to do 30% to them, 20% to the other artists, or maybe that there's a deduction in there. We're going to make 50% over the first $250 that comes in at the door. So there's points, but yet it's split somehow. Okay. In this section of your artist development plan, I recommend that you put in there something along the lines of the plan for agreements and contracts is, and then write your plan. Okay? Doesn't have to be specific, but you got to come up with a plan in order to make this work.